Hi there, I'm the Macabre, and I'm here to assist you today. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel before you watch it, since I know you use it to fall asleep. What time are you viewing right now, and where are you from? Relax and take a seat back. The trees were utterly still, their branches drawn against the starry sky like skeleton fingers reaching for the stars, and I knew that the scratch on my glass wasn't the wind. No, this was a purposeful, persistent, and increasingly loud sound. I had gone to this cottage in the woods to find some peace and quiet away from the bustle of the city. Tranquility now, as I lay frozen in my bed, with my ears alert, straining to catch every little noise, I realized how bearish this place could be and how easy it was to break that calm. In an instant it had started as a perfect getaway. I arrived at the cabin yesterday afternoon, with the sun still high in the sky warming the air, impregnated with the aroma of apit. The cabin itself was charming with its aged wood and rustic style, with a large porch perfect for sipping coffee and watching the sunrise. The rental ad promised seclusion, and boy did it deliver. The nearest neighbor was miles away, leaving me surrounded by nothing but forest and the occasional birdsong. I spent the day unpacking, exploring the nearby trails and enjoying the tranquility at nightfall. I snuggled up on the couch with a good book, savoring the absence of car horns and sirens. The only sounds were the crackling of the fireplace and the soft hum of Los Grillos outside. That's when I was getting ready for sleep that I felt it for the first time. A chill ran down the back of my neck as if someone was watching me. I shook off the feeling, scolding myself for being paranoid. I was alone here after all, there was nothing to fear, but now awake in the middle of the night, its feeling had come back harder. The scratch on my window stopped, replaced by an even more unsettling sound, creaking footsteps on the gravel outside. I held my breath, wishing my heart would stop beating so hard in my chest. Maybe it was just an animal, I told myself. A servant or even a bear were common in this area. True, the footsteps circled the cabin, slow and deliberate, stopping at every window, and I could swear I heard the sound of something breathing heavily. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but my fingers were shaking so much that I almost dropped it with no signal. Of course, I was miles from the nearest cell tower. The footsteps completed their circuit around the cab and were now on the front porch. The old wooden boards creaked under the weight of whatever was there. I had to do something. I couldn't just stand here waiting for what I didn't want to think about it. Slowly, carefully slide me over, stealthily approaching the door of the room, opening it softly, breathing when the hinges made a slight squeak. The main room of the cabin was bathed in the silver moonlight that I walked in through the windows. Everything looked different in the dark. The familiar shapes transformed into menacing shadows. I walked toward the front door with my heart in my throat. There was a baseball bat in the umbrella stand. I had seen it before and thought it was a strange place to keep. Now I was grateful. I put my fingers around the wooden handle with my fingers, the weight of it giving me a false sense of security. The porch, I had fallen silent too quietly, pressed my ear against the door, trying to hear any sound. Nothing. Maybe whatever was there was gone. Maybe I had imagined it. Everything was. About to go back to bed when I heard it thud, as if something had been gently placed on the porch, and then, unmistakably, the sound of the doorknob turning. The porch had muted too quiet. Pressure my ear against the door, trying to hear any sound. Nothing. Maybe whatever was there was gone. Maybe I had imagined it all. Was about to go back to bed when I heard it thud, as if something had been gently placed on the porch, and then unmistakably the sound of the door knob spinning. I staggered back, lifting the bat. The door wasn't closed with. I had felt so safe in the quiet of the forest that I hadn't even thought of closing it. The door began to open slowly, painfully slow. I could see a crack in the night sky, then more, and then nothing. The door was wide open, but there was no one there. I stood motionless, the bat still held high, staring at the empty threshold. The crickets had fallen silent. The whole forest seemed to hold its breath. Afterwards, from what seemed like an eternity, I put the bat down and took a hesitant step forward. I had to know, I had to see. I poked my head into the empty porch. I took another step, then another, until I was completely out. The night air, it was cold against my skin, bristling the skin on my arms. I looked to the left, then to the right. Nothing but shadows and moonlight. I was about to go back inside when something caught my attention there. On the edge of the barely visible, in the dim light, there were footprints, but they weren't animal footprints. As I had hoped, they were unmistakably human. My breath jammed in my throat as I knelt down to examine them. They were fresh, the earth still wet. They were big, much bigger than mine. I followed the trail with my gaze. They came from the woods. They went up to the porch, and then my blood was gone. Footprints led directly to the window of my bedroom. I took out my phone and switched on the flashlight with unsteady hands. The side of the cabin was illuminated by the light handle that pierced the darkness. More footprints were visible under my window, along with something deeper and longer. Scratch marks in the wood where the window and wall met. I stumbled back, my thoughts racing. This was occurring. It was genuine. I needed to go. I sprinted back to the cabin after that, slammed the door, and then locked the latch. Desperately searching for my vehicle keys, I hurried to my room, threw on the first item I came across, and slipped my feet into my hiking boots. Once again, I heard footsteps on the porch. They weren't slow or stealthy this time, though, so I threw myself to the back door, yanked it open, and dove in. I could hear heavy breathing in the darkness behind me, and I could hear branches rustling under the weight of some footsteps chasing me. I ran like I had never run before, my lungs burning, the branches whipping my face. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I had to leave after what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes. I walked out of the forest onto the gravel road where I had parked my car, and there was a beacon of hope shining under the moon. My hands, slick with perspiration, struggled with the keys, and something kept moving through the trees behind me. Eventually, the key clicked. A dark figure appeared out of the trees as I slammed the door shut after throwing myself inside. As I turned the key in the ignition, I prayed silently. The engine roared, and I pressed the accelerator to the limit. Tires skidded on the gravel as I drove away. Kicking up dust and stones before disappearing into the road, I took a look at the rearview mirror. Standing there in the center of the road was a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette watching me. I didn't slow down until I reached the main road. The lights of the passing cars had never looked so beautiful. I drove non-stop until dawn, until I was at Except in the City. I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? I had no proof. Just a story that sounded ridiculous even to me. But sometimes on silent nights when the wind from the trees outside my apartment, I remember the scratch on the window, the footsteps on the porch, the figure in my rearview mirror, and I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up. What would have happened if I hadn't heard the scratch? What was it that was in that forest, and what did I want from me? I'll never go back to that cabin, but a part of me knows the truth. Whatever was there that night, it's still there, waiting, in the shadows of the forest, waiting for the next person to let their guard down, to forget to close the door, to ignore the feeling of being watched and dismiss it as imagination. Because sometimes the monsters are real and sometimes leave traces. ELO. When I realized that my passenger had disappeared, I knew that this would not be a normal night. 1 second there was a solid presence in my peripheral vision, and the next nothing. Just an empty seat and the incessant pounding of rain on the roof of my car. I had been driving for hours, the monotony of the highway, only broken by the occasional flash of a lightning illuminating the field. The rain had begun about an hour after I started my journey, first as a light rain, and then as a torrential downpour. I was tired, with my eyes burning from so much forcing them to see through the curtain of water that covered the windshield. Then I saw him, a lone figure on the side of the road with his thumb outstretched, soaked and miserable. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, but in the desperation of his posture made me slow down. He climbed quickly, bringing with him the smell of wet earth and something else that I couldn't quite identify. "Thank you," his voice said, just a murmur under the patter of the rain. "I thought I'd be stuck there all night." I nodded. "Rejoining the road, where are you going?" I asked, kicking him out. He was younger than I had thought at first, probably about 20 years old. His dark hair was stuck to his forehead and the water dripped down his chin, soaking his jacket. Later he replied vaguely, "I'll let you know when you have to stop." We drove in silence for a while, the rhythmic bibbing of the windshield wiper being the only sound other than rain. I was about to ask him exactly where he was going, when I noticed something strange. The rain on his side of the window wouldn't slide as it should. Instead, he seemed to avoid it, as if there was an invisible barrier between him and the glass, blinking. Convinced he was seeing wrong, when I looked again, everything seemed normal. "He must have been more tired than I thought." "You're fine?" he asked suddenly, and I almost jumped in fright. It was the first time he'd spoken since he'd gotten in the car. "Yes, all right," I replied quickly. Just a long night of driving. He nodded and looked out the window again. It's a bad night to be outside, he muttered. You never know, he might be lurking in the dark. A chill ran down my spine with his words. Though he couldn't tell exactly why he was about to answer when my phone rang, making me jump. I let go of the steering wheel with one hand and took it. Hello. I only heard static on the other end of the line. I was about to hang up when I heard it. A weak and distorted voice, but unmistakable. Help me. An icy chill ran through my body. Hello. Who is more static? And then he is not who you think he is. Get out of there. Get out now. The call, it was abruptly cut off. I put the phone down slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. Everything was fine, the passenger asked. I turned to look at him, trying to make a joke about the bad signal, but the words died in my throat. The seat was empty. I hit the brakes hard. The car skidded a little on the wet pavement. Before coming to a complete stop, I turned, checking the empty back seat. It was gone. I stayed there, the engine idling, the rain hitting the roof, trying to rationalize what had just happened. The chair was still damp from his clothes. The smell of earth was still in the air. I hadn't imagined it. With trembling hands I started the car and pushed it to the side of the road. I needed to think. It was then when my phone rang again. I looked at the screen, feeling a knot in my stomach. Unknown number. The same call I knew I shouldn't answer, but I did. Hello. The voice was clearer this time, although still distorted. Why did you pick it up? I swallowed my saliva. Fear giving way to anger. Who are you? What's going on? Hasn't left. I felt my blood freeze. It's still there, watching, waiting for the call. It cut off. I turned slowly to the passenger window. For an instant I saw it, not in the car, outside, under the rain. Our eyes met. I smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. I stepped on the gas pedal. The tires skidded on the wet asphalt as the car shot off the road. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to drive away. I drove for what seemed like hours, my white knuckles on the steering wheel, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. But there was nothing behind me, nothing except the empty road and the endless rain. Finally, tiredness overcame me. I needed to stop. I saw a sign for a rest area ahead, and I decided to enter. The parking lot was empty except for a cargo truck parked at the other end. I turned off the engine, but I left the keys in the ignition, just in case. I leaned my head against the seat, closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I had to think, logically. People don't disappear from moving cars. I had to, but then I remembered the call, the wet seat, the smile. A knock on the window made me open my eyes suddenly. A police officer was there, looking at me with concern. I rolled down the window, trying to put everything together. Well, he asked, shining his flashlight on me. You've been here for a while. Blinking, confused, I just stopped. No, but the clock on the dashboard showed that I'd spent almost an hour, yes, just resting for a moment. Little the rain exhausted me. The officer nodded. It's a bad night to be outside. My phone rang again. The officer frowned. The teacher you should answer said it could be someone worrying about you. Shaking, I took the phone. Unknown number. I took a deep breath and answered. Don't go with him. The officer kept watching me. He's not a real cop. Get out now. The call was cut off. The officer smiled. All right. Panic overcame me. I turned the key on the ignition. Yes, I think I'll keep driving. Thank you. He watched me silently as I left the parking lot. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the rain, smiling. Then a message came to my phone. Keep driving, don't stop until dawn. And above all, I didn't pick up anyone else. I pressed the steering wheel tightly. The rain kept falling, and somewhere out there, he kept waiting, and I didn't know if he was running away from danger or driving straight towards him. The first time I heard his voice on the other end of the line, I knew that this would not be a normal night. Please, whispered his voice, trembling with fear. You have to help me. I'm stuck in the building. I had been a night watchman in Hogwood Tower for 3 years, and I thought I had already seen it all. Drunk office workers who fell asleep at their desks, raccoons that they managed to sneak through the loading area, even a small fire in the server room. But this was different. My name is Mike, and up until this my job had been pretty simple. Making my rounds, checking the cameras, and making sure nothing moved in the dark. The building used to be completely empty after 10 p.m. Just me and the hum of the air conditioning. Was 2 in the morning when the call came through the emergency line. It was a direct connection to the security table. Only for real emergencies. In 3 years it had never rang. Miss, calm down, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Can you tell me where it is? I don't know, she answered with a threat of voice. It's dark. There are no windows. I think it's a storage room. I frowned. As I checked the monitors, I had access to all the cameras in the building and every hallway, every office, every staircase. Everything was empty as it got there. He asked. I don't know, he said, and I knew he was crying. He was working late, and then I don't remember. I just woke up here. Please, you have to find me. He said he would be back soon. A chill ran down my spine. Who said that? There's someone else in the building. But the line was cut. I was silent. My heart beating in my ears. I had. But the desperation in his voice had sounded all too real. I checked the recordings of the last few hours looking for any sign of someone working late. Nothing. The last person had left the building at 8:47 p.m. and since then no one had entered. I took my flashlight and radio and headed for the prank elevator, or I didn't have to check just as the doors closed. Something in the monitors caught my attention, a movement in the lobby just for a second, but enough to chill my blood, a shadow moving. That was impossible. I was the only one here. The elevator stopped on the top floor with a soft ding. I walked out with a flashlight held high, illuminating the darkness. The air here felt different, heavy. I shook the feeling and started my I checked every office, every meeting room, every possible corner. Nothing. The building was empty. But then I heard a thud from above. But that didn't make sense. I was on the top floor, or I didn't remember a rumor I heard when I started working here. Something about a hidden floor that didn't appear in the official plans. I had always considered it a myth, but now I walked the wall next to the elevator looking for something out of place. Then I saw a slight change in the paint, like a handprint. Pressed my palm against it. A panel slid silently, revealing a narrow staircase leading upwards. My radio creaked, suddenly making me jump. "Mike, you're there." It was Tom, the guard of the Ma. Wasn't supposed to arrive for 4 hours. "Yes, I'm here," I replied, my tense voice. "Tom, something weird is going on. I think there's someone in the building." "How impossible. I am checking the cameras, and there's no one." I opened my mouth to tell her about the hidden staircase when I heard another knock up, louder, closer. "Tom, listens and tell them that my radio died." Absolute silence. I looked at the staircase. Everything in me screamed to leave, to wait for reinforcements. But if the girl was up there, I took a deep breath and started to rise. The air got colder with each step. The ace of my flashlight, it seemed to dim as if darkness absorbed the light. I reached the bottom of the staircase and found myself in a narrow hallway toothed to the rest of the building. The walls were bare concrete. The floor was covered with dust and cracks. "Hello," I called, my voice echoing silence. I stepped forward, testing the doors on each side of the corridor. They were all closed except for one, the last one ajar. I pushed it slowly. It was an old office, old desks, filing cabinets covered of dust, and there on the floor I saw a pale hand. Motionless, my heart stopped. I ran to her. "Miss, listens to me." I walked around the desk and froze. It wasn't just a hand. It was a body of a young woman, long hair covering her face. She wouldn't move. I kneeled, my wrist looking for a pulse, cold as ice, and then she moved. Not like someone who wakes up. Her movements were erratic, unnatural. Her head, she stood up suddenly. Her hair fell to the sides, revealing a face with completely black eyes. I stepped back. Tripping over the desk, the thing that looked like a woman began to sit up, but not normally. Every movement was clumsy, like a puppet with tangled threads, and then the same voice of the call spoke. "You came." But her mouth didn't move. The voice came from everywhere. I ran, my flashlight fell, but I didn't. It mattered. I shot into the hallway, straight to the stairs. I felt something still not running me, sliding. I got to the normal floor and threw myself into the elevator. When the doors started to close, I saw her at the end of the hallway, smiling. Not human, not real. When the elevator got to the lobby, I ran to my car. I just looked back once, at one of the windows on the top floor. A silhouette was watching me. I started the car and left. I never came back. I never quit the next day. Today, sometimes my phone rings, unknown number. I never answer, but on quiet nights, when the shadows seem to lengthen, I swear I can hear a whisper, waiting, because I know it didn't really matter if I went upstairs or not, because what was up there was waiting for me. And sometimes I wonder if I'll ever find it again, or if I never really managed to escape. The moment I saw those footprints inside the old barn, I knew I wasn't alone in this forest, and whatever was bathing me wasn't just a wild animal. It had come to the Black Forest looking for a few days of peace and solitude. My life in the city had become a chaos of deadlines, couple dramas, and existential crises. I thought that a few days in nature could help me clear my mind. How wrong I was. The first day went smoothly. I walked for several hours, found a perfect clearing for camping, and spent the afternoon exploring the surroundings. When the sun began to go down, I gathered firewood and I lit a campfire at night, lay down under the stars, and enjoyed the silence. It was the next day when everything started to feel bad. I woke up and noticed that my backpack had moved. It wasn't where I had left it. At first I thought maybe a curious animal had sniffed it, but nothing was bitten or broken, just messy. It was strange. But I ignored it and went on with my day. I went deeper into the woods, following a path that was not very visible among the trees. The farther I went, the more dense the shadows grew, the more the trees obscured the sunlight, creating an eerie atmosphere. And then I saw it. an abandoned barn in a small meadow, its boards gray with age and covered in vines, as if it had been there for decades, forgotten by the world. Curiosity got the better of me, so I pushed the door open, and it creaked horrifyingly. Dust hanging in the air like golden specks in the rays of light filtered through the cracks, and there were remnants of rusty tools and rotting farm equipment. But it was the ground that froze my blood. New footprints were not from animals, they were human, and they weren't mine. My heart started racing, wondering who else could be here. I turned and quickly left the barn after seeing something much worse, maybe from that same morning. As I glanced up, an inscription written on the wall that looked like dried blood was approaching. The air was rushing, and it got heavy around me. But before I could go away, I saw something among the trees, a short shadow, too thin to be human. It moved in an unnatural way, as if his bones were bent at wrong angles, and then I heard it. A rustling of branches from another point in the forest wasn't just one thing. There were several. My instinct screamed at me to run. I ran without thinking. No matter the direction, the branches hit my face. The roots almost tripped me behind me. Something was running too. I couldn't see it, but I heard it, the sound of multiple legs moving through the undergrowth. I finally reached my camp, but what I saw made me stop and dry. My tent was gone. There was no sign of it, just the crushed grass where my backpack had been, my food, everything was gone. I turned around with my heart in my throat. Among the trees, something was watching me. I could see her eyes shining in the gloom. They were too many eyes, too big, and she was approaching. I wasn't going to wait to see what they were. I ran. I didn't care if I was going in the right direction. I didn't care if I got lost. I just knew that if I stopped, I'd die right there after what seemed like an eternity. I saw the dirt road and ahead my car. My legs barely responded when I got to it. Shaking, I opened the door, started the engine, and accelerated like a madman. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw figures of shadows standing on the edge from the forest looking at me. As soon as I got to the nearest town, I went to the police. But when the officers went to inspect the forest, they found nothing. No barn, no trace of my camp, as if they had never existed. But I know what I saw. And ever since, I don't go back to the forest because whomever lived there let me go. Not out of compassion, but because he knows that I would return there eventually. I assumed he was dreaming when I first saw him standing beside my bed. His figure arose in the shadows, still and still. He blinked and vanished. If only I had known at that moment that my nightmare was just beginning. I had moved into the apartment a month ago. It wasn't a big deal. Just a small one-bedroom apartment in a quiet part of town. The rent was cheap. What it should have been. It was my first sign that something was wrong. But I was desperate for a place of my own after a complicated breakup, and when the landlord, Mr. Keegan, showed me the place, I was too relieved to notice the way his eyes lingered too long in some corners, or how he seemed to know the layout of the apartment without having to look at it. The first few weeks were normal, unpacking the control of my life, but then little things started to happen. A book I was sure I had left on the coffee table was back on the shelf. The milk in the fridge seemed to be lower than I remembered. My favorite mug was showing up in another cupboard. At first I put it down to my distraction. I was stressed, working long hours at my new job, so it was normal to forget where I left things. But over time the feeling that something wasn't right began to grow. There were days when I got home the air felt different, as if someone else had been there. A strange, smelly moss permeated the atmosphere, and one night I heard footsteps in the hallway, outside my room. I got up to check, but there was no one. The third week I woke up and found the window of my room open. I always locked it, especially since I was downstairs. The cold early morning air gave me goosebumps as I approached. That's when I saw the footprint, a muddy foot just inside my room by the window. My heart was pounding. I forced myself to think rationally. Maybe I'd left it open and the wind pushed it. Maybe the mark was mine. I called the police, but they found nothing. With no signs, forced entry, without fingerprints. They suggested to me that maybe I had forgotten to close the window. They told me that the footprint could have been mine. I wanted to believe them, but that night I didn't sleep. Every creak of the building, every shadow had me alert. It was in one of those night watches when I saw him for the first time. A dark figure standing at the foot of my bed. He didn't move, he didn't breathe. I turned on the lamp on the table at night and it disappeared. I told myself that it was my imagination, a product of fatigue and stress. But the next night I saw it again. I decided to take action. I bought a security camera, one of those that looked like a digital clock. I placed it on my dresser, pointing at the bed. The first night's nothing just me tossing and turning. But the fourth night, everything changed that morning. Before going to work I reviewed the recording. What I saw chilled my blood. At 2:30 in the morning, my bedroom door slowly opened and someone came in. Mr. Keegan, my landlord, stood still watching me sleep, then started moving, pacing my room calmly, touched my things, my brush, the book on the bedside table, opened my closet and ran his hand over my clothes, all while I was sleeping. After a few minutes he came. Closer to the bed he leaned over me. His face was only inches from mine. He stayed like this, watching me. Then, as silently as he had entered, he came out. I turned off the recording feeling nauseous. He had been in my room. He had been watching me. How many times had he done it before? He wanted to call the police, but part of me doubted, and if they didn't believe me, and if he found out and retaliated. He needed stronger evidence. That one night I made a plan. Pretended I was sleeping, but I stayed awake waiting. At 2:30 in the morning, I heard the click of my door lock. I slammed it open and turned on the light. There he was, frozen in the doorway for a moment. Neither of us moved. Then he smiled, not a friendly smile. The smile of a predator caught but not repentant. "You're awake," he said calmly. I got up from the bed feeling like the adrenaline ran through my body. "Get out," I said in a firm voice, "or call the police." He laughed softly and told them that your landlord came in to check his property is in the contract. "You know I can come in whenever I wanted." I got my phone, but he was faster. He grabbed my wrist tightly. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he whispered. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." Then I knew. No, he was just an invader. He was dangerous. But I wasn't going to be his victim. With my free hand, I grabbed the lamp from the table and smashed it into his head. He stumbled backwards. I unlocked the front door and shot downstairs. I didn't look back until I was on the street. I went straight to the police station. This time they heard me when they went to arrest him. They found evidence, recordings, photographs. I was not the first person. The one I bullied is now in prison. I moved to another apartment on the other side of town, but I still don't feel safe. I always check the locks 3 times before sleeping. I close the curtains, and some nights I wake up with a feeling that someone is watching me. I know that he is behind bars, but I also know that there are others like him. Others who smile kindly while they hand you the keys to an apartment with a low income and dark secrets. Others that wait until 2:30 in the morning to open your door and see how you sleep. And that's why every time I have it's that feeling that something is not right. I listen to my instinct, and I lock the doors, because the monsters of our childhood don't exist, but the royals walk among us, and some watch you while you sleep. The first time the phone rang, I thought it was a wrong number. By the 3rd call I knew someone was watching me, and by the 10th I realized that my life would never be the same again. It all started on a Tuesday night. I had just come home from work, took off my shoes and plopped down on the couch with a sigh of relief. It had been a long day full of meetings and deadlines, and all I wanted was order takeaway and watch my favorite series. Was once when my phone rang. Unknown number. I don't normally answer calls from numbers I don't recognize, but something made me answer this time. "Hello," I said, waiting for a telemarketer or maybe someone who had made a mistake. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then just as I was about to hang up, a voice spoke. Was distorted, as if someone was using a changing table. "Hello, Sarah," said the voice. "The red looks good on you today." I froze. I was wearing a red blouse. "How did they know who you are?" I demanded, with my heart starting to beat hard. The line was cut. I sat for a moment looking at my phone. Had to be a coincidence, right? Maybe someone from work making a joke, but deep down I knew it wasn't the case. I got up and went to the window. Watching the street down, everything looked normal. Cars parked along the sidewalk, a couple walking their dog, the same scene from always in my quiet suburban neighborhood. But now everything looked sinister somehow. I pulled back the curtains and double-checked the locks on doors and windows, then called my best friend Lisa. "Hey, you or someone in the office tried to prank me on a phone call." "What number? Why would we do that?" Lisa sounded confused. I explained what had happened. Lisa listened silently and then said, "That's creepy, Sarah. Maybe you should call the police." I considered it, but what would I tell them? That I got a strange call? They'd probably just tell me to block the number, so I tried to forget. I ordered food, settled into my series, and tried to get on with my night. But an hour later my phone rang again, same unknown number. This time I didn't answer. It rang 4 times and then stopped. A moment later a text message came. "Why didn't you answer, Sarah? You don't want to talk to me?" My hands were shaking as I dropped the phone on the phone. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. I picked up the phone again and blocked the number, then turned off all the lights in my apartment and sat in the dark, watching the street through a crack in the curtains. Nothing seemed out of place. No suspicious car, no one lurking in the shadows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me that night. As soon as I slept, every noise made me jump, every shadow seemed to move. When morning finally came, I was exhausted and nerves on edge. I called work to report sick. I couldn't face leaving the house, not even bear the thought of being in public where anyone could be watching me. Around noon my phone rang again, unknown number, different. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. A minute later another message came. You stayed home today, Sarah girl, ready, but you can't hide forever. I threw the phone across the room, watching it bounce against the wall and fall to the floor. This was a madness. How did they know I was home? There were cameras in my apartment. Someone was watching me from outside. I spent the next hour checking every corner of my house, looking for hidden cameras or microphones. I didn't find anything, but that didn't make me feel better. The calls and messages continued throughout the day, each one more personal, more threatening than the last. The pizza you ordered last night looked delicious. Maybe we should share a lot next time. Your mother would be so disappointed if she knew what you did last summer. I wonder if your boss knows about those files you accessed after hours. How did they know these things? Pizza was easy to understand. If someone was looking at my building, but my mother's, the files at work, that was information no stranger should have. At nightfall, I was a mess. I hadn't eaten a shower. I hadn't done anything but walk in circles around my apartment and jump at any noise. Then the last call came. This time when I answered, the voice wasn't distorted. "Hi Sarah," said a man with a soft and refined voice. "I think it's time for us to meet in person. You don't believe who you are," I whispered in a trembling voice. "Oh," Sarah laughed. "It's not about what I want from you, it's about what you're going to do for me." "I'm going to call the police," I said, trying to sound brave. "No, you won't," he replied calmly, "because if you do, I'll have to share some very interesting information with certain people. Information about what really happened to your father's company. About where that money really went." I felt a cold run through my body. How could I know that I'd been so careful? I'd covered my tracks so well. "What do you want?" I asked, defeated. "I'll see you at the corner of 5th and Main in an hour," she said. "Come alone or things will get very unpleasant for you and your loved ones." The call was cut off. I stood there with my mind spinning. I could run, but where she seemed to know everything about me, she could call in the end. I did the only thing I could think of. I wrote everything that had happened. I sealed it in an envelope with Lisa's name on it and left it on the kitchen table. Then I took my keys and walked out. The streets were quiet as I drove to the meeting point. I didn't know my life was about to change forever. The streets were empty when I got to the intersection of Quinta and Main. Was late and a light rain was falling, covering the city with a spectral glow under the lights of the lanterns. I parked a block away and walked the rest of the way with my heart beating so hard that I almost drowned out the sound of my own footsteps. There he was under the flickering light of a street lamp. A tall, well-dressed man waited with an expression of absolute calm. It was not what that I had imagined, with his peppered hair and impeccable black coat. He looked more like a businessman than the kind of person who would make anonymous threats. But then he smiled, a cold, calculating, empty smile. "Sarah," said my name familiarly, as if we already knew each other. "Good to see you in person." I didn't shake her hand when she held it out. "What do you want from me?" I asked in a tense voice. "I like you to go straight to the point." She pulled out a small USB from his pocket and held it in front of me. "And here are names and account numbers. I need you to do what you do best." A shiver ran down my spine. "You want me to launder money for you?" His smile widened. "Always so ready." I stared at him, feeling the weight of my own story on my shoulders. I had done this before. I had used my skills to hide money in the past, a mistake I had run from for years. Now the past had come back to catch me. "And if I refuse?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. His expression didn't change. "Then I'll make a few calls. Someone very important will receive information about the missing funds from your father's company. Maybe even your mother will get a detailed letter about her daughter's unethical decisions." I had no way out. My mind worked frantically looking for a solution, but each path led to a conclusion inevitable. Either I did what he asked me, or I lost everything. Slowly I reached out and took the USB. "I will do it." My voice sounded firmer than I felt. He bowed his head in approval. "Good girl." I took a deep breath, trying to control my tremors, but something didn't add up. If he had so much control over me, what guarantee I had that I wouldn't I'd come back to ask me for more favors in the future? "How do I know after this you'll leave me alone?" I asked for the first time. His smile disappeared. "I don't know." There was the truth. I realized it would never stop. Today it was this. Tomorrow it would be something else. There would always be more unless I stopped it. The idea hit me with the force of lightning. I couldn't just run away. I had to fight back with a movement. I quickly turned his wrist at an unexpected angle, making him drop his phone. He grunted in pain, surprised by my reaction. The device fell to the ground and I grabbed it even before him. My only thought was to run. I threw myself into the street, feeling the beating of my heart in my ears. Behind me I heard his furious exclamation. I ran as if my life depended on it, because it probably did. I arrived at the police station out of breath, with clothes soaked by the rain and fingers squeezing the USB and the phone tightly. I guard with desperation. I need to report a crime. The officer looked at me suspiciously. Miss, calm down. What happened? I put the USB and the phone on the counter, and I need to confess one. The policeman the truth that he had been chasing me for years. They took me to a room to take my statement while they analyzed the information on the USB. Hours later I heard the news. They had arrested my stalker at the bus station trying to flee the city. Not only was he wanted in several states, but the information on the USB linked his network to large-scale corruption. Weeks passed. I knew they would face serious charges, and I too would have to face my own consequences. I would probably go to trial, maybe even prison, but for the first time in years I was breathing freely. No more threatening calls, no more shadows stalking me. I had given up my darkest secret, and although the future was uncertain, there was one thing I did know for sure. I didn't have to run away anymore, because now I was in control of my life again. The moment I opened the photo album and saw my own face in a picture from 100 years ago, I knew that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't possible. It didn't make sense. But there I was in a yellowed, weathered photo taken in 1924 with the same face I have today, and that was the first clue that my life wasn't what I thought it was. It all started when my grandmother passed away. She had always been reserved, almost paranoid about her past, forbade us to touch her old things, and always warned us that some of her things were not going to be taken to the past. They had to tidy their home after a death, but it's not appropriate to ask questions. That task fell to me. I spent 3 days going through dusty boxes, finding everything. Old letters, family jewelry, newspaper clippings, and then I found it. The photo album was a black leather book closed with a fabric strap. When I opened it I found dozens of old photographs, people dressed in clothes from another era, stiff smiles, dark eyes, but it was on the 5th page where my blood froze, because there I was standing next to a group of unknown people at what seemed to be an elegant party of the 20s. My face was identical to the one right now. Nose, same eyes, same mole on my cheek. A shiver ran down my spine. This could not be real. Maybe it was an ancestor with whom I shared an incredible resemblance. But under the photo in a calligraphy there was a name, Elliot 1924. That was my name. I let go of the album, feeling the air around me getting heavier. I got up and I went to the kitchen to get water, trying to calm down. But when I got back to the album, the book was closed again, as if I had never touched it. I opened it again, turning the pages in desperation, but the photo no longer. I was gone. A throb of terror hit my chest. I took a deep breath and took out my cell phone to call my mother. When she answered, her voice sounded worried. "Elliot, you're okay, Mom?" My voice trembled. "I need to ask you something about the family." There was silence. "You found something?" she asked in a whisper. "A picture of me in 1924. My mother exhaled slowly, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "Close the album, Elliot." Now the fear in his voice made my hair stand on end. "What's going on? There's no time for explanations. Just do it." But I couldn't, not after what I'd seen. And then the phone cut out. I cursed quietly, trying to call back, but there was no signal. My heart was pounding. When I returned to the album, my fingers shaking as I flipped through it, the photos had changed. Now they showed places that my high school recognized. The park where I used to play as a child, even my house, and in every picture, in every place, there was a figure in the distance, a man in a black suit standing in the shadows, looking at me. My breathing became erratic. I turned more pages, feeling the cold sweat slide down my back, and then on the last page there was a new photo taken just a few minutes ago, me sitting in the living room of my house, grandma with the album in my hands, and behind me the man in black. I threw the album on the ground and shot out the door, feeling my pulse hitting in my ears. My car was parked outside. I jumped inside and locked. My hands trembled as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine didn't start. I looked in the rearview mirror, and there he was standing on the porch, motionless, watching me. His eyes were completely black. I was short of breath. I pressed the door lock button. Even though I knew it wouldn't help, I took out my cell phone and tried to call 911. Without signal, I hit the steering wheel in frustration, trying to start the car again. Nothing. When I looked up, he had disappeared. A loud knock on the window made me scream. I turned my head immediately, but there was no one, just my own reflection on the glass, and then I realized reflection wasn't moving. My heart almost stopped. It wasn't my reflection. It was him from the other side of the glass. He smiled at me with my own face. I woke up in my bed with the sunlight filtering through the window. I looked around, panting, my body covered in cold sweat. A dream? No, because on the floor next to the bed was the photo album, and on the cover a new name had appeared engraved on the leather: Mine, Elliot, 2024, today's date. And then I knew the truth. I was next. The first time I heard the footsteps behind me, I thought it was an echo. For the third time, I knew someone was following me. For the 10th, I realized that my quiet nightly routine was about to turn into a nightmare. Always I've been a night person. I prefer to go running when the city is calm, when the noise of traffic and people disappears and only the darkness and me remain. But that night we weren't alone. I tied my tennis laces, put on my headphones, and the cool breeze came out. Night breeze was autumn, and the full moon and illuminated the streets with a pale light, projecting long shadows on the pavement. I started on my usual way to the park. The lanterns flickered at irregular intervals, creating a strobe effect that made me squint. But I didn't pay too much attention to it until I heard the footsteps, at first barely perceptible, barely a murmur behind me. I stopped to tie my shoe, taking the opportunity to cast a quick glance over my shoulder. Nothing. Only the street empties, the motionless trees, the distant sound of an auto passing. I shook my head and continued running, but then they came back louder. This time I tried to tell myself that it was my imagination, that maybe it was just the echo of my own footsteps bouncing against the facades of the buildings. But then I picked up the pace, and the footsteps too. It was no longer paranoia. Someone was following me. I entered the park, the sound of the water from the central fountain whispering in the breeze. Usually this was my favorite place to run, but that night it felt different. The air was dense, heavy. Every time I turned a corner I felt a chill running down my spine. My legs moved faster, sweat sliding down my forehead. But the steps didn't go away. They were still there, constant, persevering, lurking. I stopped in my tracks, and the steps too. I turned on my heels. No one. The avenue empty. The park plunged into silence, unsettling. Only the moonlight and the shadows of the trees. I felt my pulse hammering in my temples. Who's there? My sounded more fragile than I wanted. Nothing, just the whisper of the wind through the leaves. But I felt it. Someone was watching me. I resumed my run, but now I was speeding. Every cell of my body screamed, "Run away!" My feet hit the pavement hard, but the footsteps behind me, they also increased their speed. They were no longer trying to hide. They were chasing me. The park ended at an intersection. I just had to cross the street and I would be in a busier area. I could take refuge in a store, at a gas station, anywhere with people. But I never arrived, because when I was about to leave the park, something grabbed my arm, hands cold as ice. With brutal force I stopped suddenly, drowning, and I screamed. I tried to turn around, get away, kick, but there was no one. The hands were gone. There was nothing there. But even so I still felt the pressure on my arm, the icy mark of invisible fingers. The sound of footsteps had disappeared, but I was no longer alone. I knew it, I felt it, and worst of all, I knew that whatever it was, it would never go away. The moment I found the diary, I knew that I was supposed to have left that damn motel, but curiosity got the better of me, and by the time I realized the magnitude of my mistake, it was too late. It was only supposed to be one night, a quick stop on my cross-country journey before starting a new job in California. The Pinewood Motel was no big deal, a decaying two-story building that had probably had its best time in the year 70, but it was cheap, and I was tired, so I turned into her almost empty parking lot. Just as the sun went down, the lobby smelled of old cigarettes and cheap air freshener. The receptionist, an older woman with faded tattoos and a bored expression, barely looked up from her magazine when she handed me the room key. "Oh, departure at 11. She muttered, as if she was already saying goodbye to me. I should have noticed how her eyes hesitated, telling me the room number, as his hand seemed to hesitate for a second before giving me the key. But I was too exhausted from so many hours on the road to think about it. I just wanted a shower and a bed. The room was what I expected. Faded wallpaper, a sunken bed, and a TV so old that it had probably broadcast the moon landing live. But it was clean, and the shower had good pressure of water, was already convincing me that maybe I would be able to rest when I noticed it. A notebook just peeking out from under the bed. Probably trash from a previous guest, I thought. But when I took it out, I realized that it was an old diary with the cover worn by use. I shouldn't open it, I know now, but at that moment it seemed harmless. The first pages were normal. Boring notes from a business trip, complaints about the weather. Nothing out of the ordinary, but as I turned the pages, the writing became more erratic. The sentences were shorter, frantic. Something's wrong in this place. The walls move when I don't look at the sounds. At night, the sounds, a chill ran down my spine. But I kept reading. I tried to leave. Today the door wouldn't open. It wasn't closed, it just wouldn't move. When at last I managed to open it, the corridor was not the same. I stretched endlessly with doors on both sides. Endless. This ain't real. This can't be real. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't stop. The last pages were pure panic. I'm not alone here. Something's watching me. If you're reading this, get out. Come out now. I closed the diary, slamming, my heart beating out of control. This had to be a joke, true, a trick to scare the guests, but the room felt different now, colder, more oppressive. I decided that I was not going to find out if the newspaper was telling the truth or not. I took my suitcase and went to the door, turned the knob. It did not move. A shiver ran down my spine. I tried again with more force. Nothing. I ran to the window, thinking about going out there. It did not open. But the worst thing was when I looked outside. When I arrived, the parking lot was empty. Now it was full of cars, old cars covered in dust, cars from all decades, from the 50s to now. But there were no people. I staggered back. Number. This couldn't be happening. I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe. 1, 2, 3. I opened my eyes. The door was open, but the hallway was not the same. It stretched in both directions, endless, with identical doors on each side, just as the newspaper said. Air. I was loaded heavy with something I couldn't explain. I knew I shouldn't get out, but I couldn't stay in that room either. With every second that passed, I felt something coming closer, so I took a step outside. The hallway was in complete silence. I started walking, telling myself that I just had to find the stairs and get out of there. But no matter how much I walked, the hallway never ended. The doors on the sides, they were all the same. No numbers. Sometimes I thought I heard voices behind them. Laughter, whispers. Once I heard my own voice, as if I was inside one of those rooms talking to someone. I kept walking until I saw a door ajar. I didn't know why, but something inside me told me that I had to go inside. There was my room, but not the motel one, my childhood room. Every detail was perfect, and sitting on the bed there was me. A 10-year-old boy with the same face as me. He smiled at me, but his eyes were cold. You finally arrived, he said. We were waiting for you. I ran. I left that room, that endless corridor. I don't know how long I was wandering. Hours, days. There were no clocks or windows, until suddenly I was back in the room. Oh, the diary was on the floor, open, on a new page, in my own handwriting. If you're reading this, get out now. I dropped the diary like it burned me. A knock on the door made me jump. I knew what was coming. A new guest, someone else caught up in the psyche. 'Cause that's the secret of the Pinewood Motel. You can check in whenever you want, but you can never leave. The first time I saw his reflection in the mirror, I thought it was my imagination. The second time I froze. By the third, I knew something. I lived in my house with me. It all started when I moved into that old apartment in the center. Was small but cozy, and best of all, cheap. My friends joked, saying that it looked like a haunted place, but I laughed until they stopped being jokes. It was an ordinary night when I saw it for the first time. I had gotten out of the shower, and when I passed in front of the bathroom mirror, something called my attention. I stopped, turned slowly, and then I saw him, a tall, thin figure, with no defined face, standing right behind me. In the reflection, I turned around suddenly. There was no one. The air was cold, much colder than normal, but I thought it was just my imagination, that I was tired, that maybe it had been a shadow. But number was not the only time. The days passed, and the feeling of not being there, it only got louder. I stopped looking at the mirrors. I stopped using the bathroom with the light off. I stopped walking around the house in silence, because in the silence I could hear him breathing, watching me, until one night I saw him again. I was in the living room watching TV when the screen suddenly turned off, and there he was reflected on the black screen. Behind me, I immediately turned around to scream. Caught in the throat swims. But the air was icy, and the air of being observed was overwhelming. Since then the mirrors began to behave strangely. Sometimes when I passed by one, I saw a reflection, as if the mirror took a second longer to react, as if my reflection did not want to move at the same time as me. Other times when I stared at myself, I felt that something else was in there watching me, waiting. I tried to ignore it. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But one night everything changed. I woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that something was wrong. Everything was silent, but there was a reflection of light in my room. It came from the mirror in the closet. Someone was there. My heart was pounding. I forced myself to sit on the bed, with every muscle tense, and then I looked at the reflection. It didn't show my room as it was. It was same but different. The shadows seemed deeper, the walls darker, and there in the mirror, he was standing looking at me with a crooked smile. My reflection wasn't me. I felt the blood leave my body. I got up suddenly and ran out of the room, but something inside me, I knew I couldn't run away from this, wasn't something I could just escape from. I tried to sleep in the living room with all the lights on, but I didn't sleep. I couldn't, because on the TV screen off, I kept seeing him, waiting, smiling, knowing that sooner or later I would end up too. I was caught in his mirror, and as soon as his eyes met mine, I realized that my peaceful fishing excursion was about to become a struggle for survival. When predators choose their prey, they have a certain expression, and this guy possessed it in spades. He had gone to Hollow Lake to get away from the bustle of the city, to be alone, and maybe to go fishing. Nestled in the highlands, far from the closest town, it was a stunning location where you could lose yourself for days surrounded only by water and trees. I arrived early that morning, just as the fog was clearing over the lake. On the air was fresh, impregnated with the scent of pine and damp earth. I found a secluded spot on the shore, far from the few fishermen I had seen, settling in perfectly. I thought only me and the fish. The first few hours were exactly what I expected. The gentle splash of the waves against the shore, the occasional jump of a fish in the water, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, had caught a couple of trout good size, and I was feeling quite satisfied with my decision to come here. It was then that I first noticed him. He was about 50 met on the shore with a fishing rod in his hand, but he wasn't there and he was watching me. I tried to ignore him at first. Maybe I was just assessing the competition, seeing if I was lucky, but there was something odd about the way he stood still, too motionless, too focused. I threw my line back, trying to ignore the feeling of discomfort that was running up my back. When I looked again, he had come closer. Not much, just a few feet closer, but enough for me to see his face more clearly. He was older than me, maybe about 50 years old, with a weathered face and an unkempt beard. But it was his eyes that really caught my attention. Cold, calculating, hungry. I picked up my line, deciding it was time to move somewhere else. While I picked up my gear, I kept it in my peripheral vision. He limited my movements by picking up his own things. My heart rate accelerated. This was not normal behavior, nor far away. I headed further down the shore, away from the place where I had parked my car. In hindsight, that was my first mistake, but at that moment I thought that if I managed to putting enough distance between us, I would lose interest. I found another spot and settled down again, my hands shaking slightly. As I set up the hook, I tried to concentrate on the water, in the rhythm of casting and picking up the line, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When I went back to scan the shore, there it was closer, now about 30 m away. I wasn't even pretending to fish. I was just standing there looking at me with those predator eyes. "Hey," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "Look for a good spot. There's plenty of space over there." He didn't answer. He didn't even blink. He just kept looking at me. There I knew I was in real danger. I abandoned my equipment and started walking quickly towards the path that led to the parking lot. I heard his footsteps behind me, creaking on the gravel of the bank. I no longer tried to be silent. The path was narrow, winding through the dense forest. I quickened my pace, my breath ragged. The trees seemed to close around me. The branches stretched out like fingers trying to catch me. I tripped over a root, barely managing to stay on my feet. That's when I heard him speak for the first time. "There's no point in running." His voice said rough and cold. "There's nowhere to go here except to the water or the forest, and believe me, you don't want either of them." I ran. I didn't care about the direction anymore. I didn't care about finding my way back to my car. All that mattered was getting away from it. I made my way through the bushes, the branches clawing at my face. I could hear it behind me, moving with the confidence of someone who knew these woods well. I didn't run. I just kept a steady pace, as if I knew it would eventually catch up with me. Emerged into a small clearing, and I paused for a moment trying to get my bearings. Then I saw it, an old cabin in ruins, half hidden in the trees. Without thinking, I ran to it. Maybe I could barricade myself inside. By some time to think, the door hung on its hinges. I pushed inside, and the smell of dampness and rot hit me. The cabin was small, just a room with a few broken pieces. of furniture, no windows, no other way out. I had caught myself. I heard his footsteps on the porch. I looked desperately around, looking for something to defend myself with. There was an old fireplace poker leaning against the wall. I grabbed it, the rough rusty metal on my palm. Salt from there called, his voice closer. Now let's not make this harder than necessary. I stuck against the wall by the door. The poker held high, waiting for silence, was unbearable. The door opened slowly. I held my breath. He took a step inside, his eyes adjusting to the gloom for a brief second. He didn't see me. It was all I needed, balance, the poker with all my strength, hitting him on the shoulder. He roared in pain and staggered back. I didn't wait to see if he fell. I ran, dodging his arms that were trying to catch me, and I went out into the clearing. But he was faster than I expected. Before from reaching the trees, he knocked me down from behind. The air escaped from my lungs. When I fell to the ground, he turned around and immobilized me with his weight from up close. His eyes were even more terrifying, pale blue, almost colorless, with a madness burning inside. You thought you could escape. He growled, his face inches from mine. No one escapes from here. This is my lake, my forest. And you're just another fool who came into my home grounds. I struggled, trying to free myself, but I was too strong. His hands found my throat. Darkness clouded my vision as I struggled to breathe. Then something inside me broke. Survival instinct took over. My hands scraped the ground, looking for anything. My fingers closed around a stone. With the last of my strength, I stamped it against his head. Impact sounded like thunder. His grip loosened and fell on his side. Dazed, I staggered to my feet. I ran. I don't know how long. I just knew that eventually I reached the shore of the lake, and there, like a miracle, was the parking lot, my car. With trembling hands, I managed to put the key in the lock. As I sped away, I looked at the rearview mirror there, on the edge of the forest. He was standing, watching me, still waiting, because I knew that someday, somehow, we would meet again. The first time I heard the whispers in the cabin, I thought it was the wind. The second time we made sure nature can offer. The cabin was small, rustic but cozy. No Wi-Fi, no TV, just me, a lot of books, and the sound of the trees swaying in the wind. Oh, I thought the first night was strange. I woke up in the early morning with the feeling that someone was in the cabin with me. I didn't hear any particular noise, but the atmosphere was different, as if the air was heavier, as if the silence hid something. I got up, checked the doors and windows. Everything was closed. But when I got back to bed, I heard something, a whisper so low that I couldn't understand what it was saying, but it was there just outside the bed. In my room, I lay motionless, holding my breath, listening, but the sound never repeated, and eventually I went back to sleep. The next day, I tried to convince myself that it had been my imagination, maybe the wind seeping through the cracks of the cabin, maybe tiredness playing tricks on me, but something kept bothering me, that feeling of being watched. Every time I looked out the window, I felt like something was looking at me from the woods. Every time I passed in front of the bathroom mirror, I thought I saw a shadow moving behind me, but whenever I turned around, nothing. On the second night, the whispers came louder, clearer. They no longer came from outside the room. They came from inside, from the darkest corners, from under the bed, from the closet whose door looked slightly open that time. Yes, I understood what they were saying. Let me out. I got up, I jumped up and turned on all the lights, opened the closet at once. Nothing. Just my clothes hanging and some suitcases, but the air was icy. Fear began to settle in my mind. I tried to distract myself with a book with music on my phone. But every time the silence returned, the whispers too, and they were more and more insistent, clearer, more desperate. Let me out. I'm trapped, please. Until I finally asked who you are. The cabin fell completely silent, and then I heard the answer. A hoarse voice, broken as if I hadn't spoken in years. I was you. My blood froze. I ran out of the cabin. No matter how cold, no matter how dark. The forest. My only option was my car. But when I caught up with it, I saw my reflection in the window, and it wasn't me. It was another version of me, pale, haggard, with a smile twisted. Let me out. The reflection raised its hand, but I hadn't moved. I backed away, trembling, and before I could react, the reflection took a step out of the glass. The last I remember is its icy hand closing over my throat, and then darkness. I woke up in the cabin at dawn. The fire in the fireplace was still burning. Everything seemed normal. But something inside me felt different. When I got up and went to the bathroom, I looked in the mirror. It was me, but my eyes were no longer the same. The cabin is empty now, but every once in a while, in the reflections of the glass in the bathroom mirror, I can see another me, the one who was trapped in the woods, the one who keeps whispering, waiting to leave. The moment I realized we were going in the wrong direction, I knew I'd made a Terrible mistake, but bye. Then it was too late, the doors were locked, the man behind the wheel was no longer the kind stranger I'd pretended to be, and the vast wilderness around us stretched out with no end in sight. Everything began innocently enough when my ancient Chevy finally died in the middle of the road in a rural area of New Mexico. I had been traveling through a desolate area of low plants and sand, sometimes interrupted by the silhouette of a cactus. I was unable to really appreciate the sunset, which was tinting the sky orange and purple. What I was doing was all I could think about. I made many attempts to start the engine, but it just produced a depressing noise before shutting off. With no reception, I pulled out my phone. I was confined. At that moment, I saw a car's headlights coming from a distance. Someone could aid me, or at least drive me to the next town. I breathed with relief. The car, an ancient pickup truck, came to a halt beside me. The driver pulled down the window, a middle-aged guy with a warm grin and a worn face. "Is there an issue with the vehicle?" His voice was gruff yet kind as he inquired. I explained the problem while nodding. After attentively listening, he volunteered to drive me. "It takes a few minutes to go to the closest petrol station. 50 kilometers from here. I can take you from there. You can call a tow truck." Hesitant for a moment, my mother's warnings about accepting rides from strangers echoed in my head. But what other option did I have? Staying there meant waiting for hours, maybe days, until another car passed by. "That would be amazing," I said, taking my backpack and getting into the passenger seat. He introduced himself as Frank. While starting the engine inside the truck, it smelled like old leather and tobacco. The radio was playing at low volume, a country song I didn't recognize. We chatted as I drove. He asked about me. Where was I going? Where did I come from? I told him I was heading to Los Angeles for a new job. I mentioned I had no family nearby, just some friends to share an apartment with. He nodded and kept driving. But then something started to feel strange. He was asking me too many questions. Questions about me, family, on if anyone knew exactly where I was on the road. I started to feel uncomfortable, and then I noticed something that made my blood rise. The sun that was before in front of us as I drove west. Now it was on our left. We were going in the opposite direction. I swallowed, trying not to sound alarmed. Frank said calmly, "I think we're going in the wrong direction." The silence in the van turned thick. Didn't respond right away. When it did, his voice no longer sounded friendly. He didn't just say, "Let's go in the right direction." A chill ran down my spine. I tried to open the door. He didn't move. I looked at Frank. He was smiling. But it was no longer a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who knew something I didn't. "Where are you taking me?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. His smile widened to a place where no one will bother us. A panicked scream got stuck in my throat. I looked for something, anything I could use as a weapon, but the truck was spotless. No loose tools. Nothing within reach. "Please, Frank," I said, trying to control my voice. "Let me down." He let out a raspy laugh. "Oh, no, not now." After all this effort, the truck went off the road. Into a road. The vehicle jumped and creaked on the loose rocks. Mine paralyzed me. I was after about 20 minutes driving aimlessly through the desert. He stopped the car in a clearing between two large rock formations. He ordered a revolver from under his seat. Terror clouded my mind. But if I wanted to get out of this, I had to think fast. I went down slowly with my hands up. He pointed the gun at me and pointed to a path that led to a crevice between the rocks. "Walk." Every fiber of my being screaming at me, "Run," but I knew I wouldn't get far with a gun pointed at me, so I walked. Every step was a countdown to the inevitable. But then I saw it, a piece of shiny metal poking out of the sand, a piece of rusty construction rod. I didn't think about it. I threw myself at it, grabbing her just as Frank reacted. "Hey, what the hell are you like this?" I didn't let him finish. With all my might, I hit his wrist with the rod. The revolver fell. He screamed in pain. I ran. I had no idea where. I just knew I had to get away from him. The sound of his footsteps behind me, it was the only thing I heard other than my own breathing shaken. My legs were burning. The dry air was tearing at my lungs. But I kept running. The lights in the distance. In the distance there were lights, a road. My only chance. I ran faster. But Frank was getting closer. Then my foot tripped over a rock. I fell rolling down the hill. The pain exploded in my body, but I couldn't stop. I staggered up and kept moving forward. The headlights of a car were approaching. I threw myself into the road, waving his arms frantically. The car slammed on the brakes. The driver, an older man, rolled down his window, his eyes full of confusion and fear. "Please help me," gasped. "A man is chasing me. He has a gun." The man looked at me for a second and then opened the back door. He enters. I didn't hesitate. Just as Frank's truck emerged from the shadows, the car accelerated, leaving a cloud of dust behind it. Frank stayed behind, watching me drive away. We got to the nearest town and went straight to the police station. They hit Frank's truck, but he was gone. Since that day, I've always been looking over my shoulder because I know Frank is still out there waiting for another confident traveler to stand on the road waiting for his next victim. The first time I heard banging on the wall, I thought it was my neighbor. The second time I knew they were coming from inside my apartment. The third time I understood that something wanted to come out. I moved into this apartment a month ago, a cozy little place in an old downtown building. It wasn't perfect. The floors creaked. The heating worked when I wanted to, and the walls were so thin that I could hear my neighbors arguing almost every night. But it was mine. My first space, or at least that's what I thought the first time I heard the knocks. Was on any given night. I was lying half asleep when I heard a knock on the wall next to my bed. Rhythmic, soft at first, but constant. Knock, knock, knock. I jumped completely. I lived on the top floor, so there was no one above me, and my neighbor on the other side of the wall wasn't there. I knew it because I never went out, left the TV on, and that one didn't. The apartment next door was completely quiet. But so knock, 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 knock. Insistent knocks, like someone was inside the wall that night. I didn't sleep well, but the next morning in the daylight, everything seemed less scary. Old walls creak, old buildings make strange noises. I convinced myself it was nothing until the knocks returned. Night the sound came back, not only on the wall next to my bed, but in different parts of the apartment. The bathroom, the kitchen, even the closet, always the same rhythm, always the same insistence. I got up, walked around the apartment with a flashlight. Nothing. I approached the wall, resting my hand on the place where the gulps came from. The cold I felt in my fingertips made me shudder at the sound. It stopped in its tracks, but as soon as I walked away, knock, knock, knock. On the third day something changed. The knocks were no longer coming from the wall. They were coming from inside the closet. I plucked up the courage and opened the door. Suddenly, nothing. Just my hanging clothes, shoe boxes, and some things that I hadn't unpacked yet. But the air was icy, and when I closed the door I saw something that wasn't there before. A sentence written with something dark and dry in the wood of the door. "Let me out." I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't, because every time I closed my eyes I heard whispers, incomplete sentences, words I didn't understand, murmurs coming from inside the wall. At 3 in the morning, the loudest blow of all made me jump out of bed. Knock, 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 knock. This time it didn't stop. The blows were furious, desperate. I ran to the front door. I decided to run out of the apartment, but when I turned the knob, it was stuck. I couldn't get out behind me. The sound changed. It wasn't knocks anymore. It was scratches, as if something inside the wall was trying to break through. Something I didn't want to go, something I wanted to stay. The wall cracked. I saw the paint crack, the plaster crumble. Something dark began to seep through the crack. Something that was moving. I screamed, kicked the door with all my might in despair. Finally the lock was given, and I threw myself out of the apartment, stumbling in the hallway. When I looked back at the wall, it was intact. No cracks, no scratches, no marks, just the same old silent apartment. And in the dark, just before I closed the door, I heard a low and raspy laugh, a whisper that chilled my blood. The next day I moved in. I didn't come back to get my things. I didn't want to find out anymore. I just walked out of that damn apartment and never looked back. But sometimes on silent nights when the world is calm, I hear a distant sound. A sound that shouldn't be there. Knock, knock, knock. And I know that wherever it is, whatever was trapped in those walls is still looking for me. It still wants to get out, and someday it will. The moment I heard the footsteps in the attic, I knew this house wasn't that empty as I thought. My parents always kept that door locked, but now in the middle of the night something was moving up there, and I was about to find out. By some doors it's better not to open them. It was never supposed to be a quiet week. My parents were finally gone on vacation to Europe and asked me to take care of the house while they were away. At 25, I was no longer the type of person who would throw wild parties in the absence of my parents. So they fully trusted me. I thought it would be a good opportunity to enjoy the silence of the neighborhood, the spacious house, and my mother's well-stocked food. The first few days passed without incident. I worked from my father's office. I cooked, watched a few movies, and enjoyed the peace. But on the third night everything changed. I was up late watching a series on Netflix when I heard a thud. as if something heavy had fallen on the attic wood floor. At first I ignored it. The house was old and had always had its random creaks and sounds, but then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate steps. I felt a chill run down my spine. The attic was always off limits when I was a child. My parents said it was full of old, fragile, dusty and dangerous things, but now someone was up there. I got up cautiously, pausing the series, turned off the lights and held my breath. The footsteps stopped. I approached the staircase that led to the attic. Looking up, the door that had always been locked was ajar. My curiosity overcame my strong heart, which prompted me to call the police and leave the house right away. I gritted my teeth and started to climb the stairs one by one, each one creaking in the old wood. The air in the attic was heavy with moisture and dust, and there were boxes piled up and furniture covered in white sheets. Then I noticed fresh footprints in the dust, as if someone had just been there minutes before. I moved slowly, following the marks on the floor, and they led me to an old wooden chest of drawers with a large mirror on top. The mirror was covered in dust, but beneath that dark layer, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. I froze, turned abruptly, and saw that no one was there, but the footprints in the dust had changed. They were now moving in the opposite direction, as if something had come out. Fear paralyzed me, and then I heard a whisper, not from the wind or the old wood. My name was Alex, and I ran. I went downstairs 2 by 2, slamming the door shut and locking it against my chest. I went to the kitchen, trembling, and I grabbed my cell phone and dialed my mother's number. It was 3:12 in her time zone, and she answered half asleep. "Alex, what's up, Mom?" My voice broke. "There's someone in the attic." There was a long, too long silence, and then she whispered something I would never forget. I knew it would happen eventually, and my skin stood on end. I would rest. My mother seemed nervous, as if she was doubting if she should tell me more. "Mom, tell me the truth." She took a deep breath before talking. "You're not alone in that house, Alex. You've never been." The line went down. My phone suddenly turned off, as if the battery had run out, but I knew she was at 60. Before I called her, I felt the air get heavier. The atmosphere changed. An invisible presence surrounded me, and then the lights flicker. A loud noise came from the attic, like someone was banging on the door with fury. Boom, boom, boom. I ran to the door of the house, but it wouldn't open. I turned the knob in desperation. Nothing was stuck. I looked back at the attic staircase. The door was opening by itself, and then I saw the tall silhouette, dark, faceless, but with white eyes, empty like 2 dead lights in the darkness. He took a step towards me. I screamed, and everything went black. I woke up in the living room with the dawn sneaking through the windows. The attic was locked. Again, as if nothing had ever happened. It was a dream. A hallucination, I don't know, but since that night the lights flicker every morning, and every time I pass by the stairs I feel that someone is watching me from the darkness. Parents never told me anymore, but I know one thing: never again. I'll go up to that attic, 'cause something lives up there, and it doesn't want me to go away. The moment I saw a human slip into his jacket, I knew this overnight bus ride was about to turn into a fight for survival. But what I didn't know was that the real danger wasn't just the man with the knife. It was that the darkness that slept inside me had boarded the Greyhound in Chicago, bound for a small town in Indiana where my grandmother lived. Was a last-minute decision prompted by a call from the nursing home where she was interned. "It's asking for you," they said. "Maybe you want to come soon." I knew what it meant, so I stuffed some clothes in a backpack, bought a ticket, and found myself on the 11 p.m. bus. Surrounded by a mix of late-night commuters, the bus was half full. Some college students with headphones, probably returning home at the end of the week, a couple of exhausted-looking women, nurses or waitresses, after a long shift, and in the back a few rough-looking men who stood out of the way. I chose a seat near the middle, securing my backpack under my feet. When the bus started, I leaned my head against the window, watching the city lights fade neon, the hum of the engine fading, and the balance of the vehicle lulled me into a light sleep. I don't know how long it was. When I felt that sensation on the back of my neck, that itching on my skin when you know someone is looking at you, I opened my eyes slowly, not wanting to alert whoever was watching me. Through the reflection in the window, I saw a man who wasn't there before. He had changed seats. Now he was directly behind of me, was leaning forward, his gaze fixed on the back of my head. My heart raced, but I tried to stay calm. Maybe I was just looking out the window. Maybe I was imagining things. I shifted in my seat, pretending to stretch and yawn as if I had just woken up. Then I saw him well. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with a sloppy beard and eyes that shone with an unsettling intensity in the dim bus lighting when our eyes met. He didn't look away. Instead, he smiled. At last awake, sleeping beauty. His voice was low, harsh. You murmur on your phones. We were on a dark stretch of highway, nothing but fields and woods on either side. Then I felt him lean closer. His hot breath brushed my ear. You have some money, baby? Or maybe a nice phone I can take borrowed? My blood froze. This was really happening. I was going to be mugged on a Greyhound bus in the middle of nowhere. I don't have much, I managed to say in a trembling voice. Just a few dollars for food. He laughed softly, but there was no humor in the sound. Don't lie to me. I've been watching. My skin bristled. Backpack, nice decent clothes. I bet you have all kinds of treasures there. I turned to face him, hoping to reason with him, appeal to any traces of humanity he might still have left. It was then that I saw his hand disappear into his jacket, and I knew what was coming. Time seemed to slow down. I saw the gleam of the metal as he pulled out the small but deadly sharp knife. I saw the way his eyes swept around the bus, making sure no one was watching. And I saw the exact moment he decided he was going to use it regardless of whether I cooperated or not. Something inside me changed. In that instant, the fear did not disappear, but it was replaced by something else. A coldness. Clara, an icy determination. A voice in my head that whispered, "No, not today, me." When her hand was raised with the knife, I moved. All those kinds of self-defense that my mother insisted I take, they made sense. At that moment I grabbed her wrist with both hands, twisting it hard as I dug my elbow into his face. I felt something crack, probably his nose, and he let out a muffled cry of pain and surprise. The knife fell to the floor. I jumped on the seat, falling on him. We got into a desperate struggle in the narrow aisle. I heard screams from other passengers, the driver shouting something about stopping the bus. His fingers managed to close around my throat, squeezing hard dots. Black people began to cloud my vision. My hands groped on the ground looking for the knife. My fingers closed on the handle just as I felt consciousness vanish. I didn't think, I just acted. The knife sank right under his ribs, entered with horrible ease. His eyes opened wide. His grip on my neck loosened. I pushed him away from me, gasping for air. Blood spread through his shirt. The bus stopped in secco on the shoulder of the road. The nurse, who was a few rows away, ran up to him, knelt beside him to check his pulse. He felt a dizziness of relief. I had not killed him. He was not a murderer. The next few hours were a whirlwind of police lights, statements, and questions. They photographed the bruises on my neck. They took the knife as evidence. They interrogated me and again. When they were done, the sky was beginning to clear with the first hints of dawn. An officer told me that it was a clear case of self-defense, that I was free to leave while waiting for the next bus. I couldn't stop thinking about the man I had been a few hours ago, not the attacker, but I had always considered myself someone calm, pacific, but now I knew the truth at the right time. When if I demanded it, I could be capable of anything. The new bus arrived with the first rays of sunshine. This time I chose a seat in the front, away from the other passengers. As the vehicle rolled towards my destination, I saw my reflection in the window, and I knew I would never be the same again. The world felt different, now more dangerous, but also more controllable, and I understood something terrifying. I had won, I had survived, and now I'd never be caught off guard again. I headed to say goodbye to my grandmother, and then I'd find out who this new version of me was, because the young man who boarded that bus in Chicago died on the road that night. What was left in place was something stronger, something darker, something ready to face whatever. The moment I saw the man standing in my living room, I knew I'd committed a terrible mistake. But by then it was too late. The storm was roaring outside. The blackout had plunged the house into complete darkness, and I was stuck in my own home with a stranger who had no intention of delivering a package. It had all started as an ordinary night. I was working from home, rushing to finish a project while the wind whipped the windows and the rain hit the roof like a drum. The weather had gotten worse all day. By the time night fell, the storm was at its peak. The lights flickered several times, but I kept working, hoping the power supply would hold up, and then someone knocked on the door. I jumped out. Who the hell was coming here in this weather? Then I remembered I had placed an order online, and the tracking said it would arrive today. Maybe the delivery man had been stuck in the storm. I went to the door and looked through the peephole. There he was, a man in a soaked parcel uniform holding a package in the rain. He knocked on the door again. "Hello, package for you. I can come in a moment." It's horrible out there. In hindsight, That was the moment I should have closed the door and told me to leave it on the ground, but I saw him shaking, soaking wet, and I felt sorry for him. Like this, I opened the door. Yes, of course, it happens. I don't want you to get sick out there. He smiled and quickly entered. The smell of rain and humidity filled the hall. I closed the door behind him, shaking my head at the intensity of the wind. You can leave the package on the table, I told him. Heading to the kitchen. Do you want a coffee to warm you up? He didn't answer. The silence made me turn around. He hadn't left the package on the table. He wasn't taking off his jacket. He was walking me fixedly. It was then that I knew this man was not a delivery man. The power went out suddenly. The house was plunged into total darkness, and I heard him move. I ran blindly without knowing where. I heard his footsteps behind me, chasing me in the semi-darkness. I knew that my only advantage was that I knew the house, and he didn't run to the kitchen groping for something to defend myself with. My fingers touched a rolling pin. I grabbed it tightly. Waiting in the darkness, I heard its breathing very close. It doesn't have to be like this. Its voice came from some corner of the room. Don't be difficult. My heart was pounding. I knew I couldn't stay here. If it caught me, I wouldn't live to tell the tale. I slowly slid to the back door, making sure not to make a sound. But before that I could reach her, he moved. I heard his clothes rubbing against the wood of the door frame. I threw myself towards the exit. His hand brushed my arm, trying to catch me. I ran upstairs, the bathroom. I was able to lock myself there. I arrived just when he reached the last step. I threw myself inside and locked it. Come on, don't make this any harder. His voice sounded calm, funny, as if this were a game. I looked around. No. He was in the living room, where I had left my phone to charge. My only choice was the window, which I grudgingly opened as the rain pelted my face below. I could leap since the porch ceiling was less than 2 meters. I reacted when I heard a knock on the door. Darling, I'm going in. Without more delay, I scaled to the window's edge and sprang to the roof. He took my breath out of breath. I rolled on the slippery tile, struggling not to fall from inside. I heard the bathroom door break. He had entered. I looked at the street lights, my neighbor's house. If I could get there, my feet would be safe. To the edge of the roof, and I jumped. I fell on the grass, the pain running down my legs, but I didn't stop. I ran barefoot in the rain, not daring to look back. I hit my neighbor's door with all my strength. Help, please open. Lights. Lighting hurried. Steps. The door opened and I collapsed on the threshold. They called the police, but when the agents arrived at my house, he was no longer there. Were no signs of forced entry, only the package intact, still on the table. The police believed me, but they could not do nothing. No one saw him come in. No one saw him leave. There were no security cameras, and worst of all, they didn't find any traces, as if he had never been there. But I know he was. I know what I saw. I know what I felt. Since then I don't open the door without double-checking who's outside. I don't trust the uniforms, and every time there's a storm I lock all the doors, because I know that he's still outside, waiting for another dark night, waiting for someone else to make the same mistake as me. The moment I saw the fresh footprints in the dust of the abandoned attraction, I knew we weren't alone. What started as a thrilling urban exploration was about to turn into a nightmare that none of us would ever forget. Was Sarah's idea. She was always the most adventurous of the group, the one who gave us. She was pushing us to try new things, to get out of our comfort zone. When she showed us photos of the old Paradise Park, an amusement park closed more than a decade ago, covered with weeds and oblivion, we couldn't resist. There were 4 of us: Sarah, the reckless Mike, her boyfriend, always trying to impress her, Jess, my best friend from kindergarten, and I, Alex, the one who always ended up in these messes, arrived just at sunset. Long shadows covered the rusty signs and ruined rides. The park had raided after a series of fatal accidents, embroiled in debts and lawsuits. It was now an empty shell, a ghostly reminder of happier times. This is incredible, Sarah whispered, sliding her body delgado through a gap in the fence. We followed her. The park paths were covered with grass and debris. Our steps creaked on the gravel, breaking the heavy silence of the place. Ahead, the great Ferris wheel stood like a steel skeleton against the dark sky. Let's go to the House of Mirrors, Mike suggested, pointing to a building with peeling paint. A faded clown was painted over the entrance. His smile seemed more like a wince. Just as Sarah pushed the door open, I noticed something strange. The old wood opened too easily, and rotten. It should have been stuck, but the door was given as if someone had used it recently. Then I saw them in the accumulated dust on the floor. There were fresh footprints. They weren't our girls. I said, feeling a chill run down my spine, but they had already entered and I stupidly followed it inside. The air was thick and it smelled damp and rotten wood. The mirrors, many cracked, covered with dust, reflected our figures in distorted and grotesque shapes. "Jess," she screamed. We ran to her and found her white as a paper, pointing at one of the mirrors. "Intact, I just saw something." There we approached. Only our reflections were staring back at us. But something was wrong. There were 5 people. Reflected, we were 4. The 5th reflection was a tall and thin figure with abnormally long limbs, her face covered by a shadow. None of us had moved. But the reflection, yes, and she was looking at us. The first sound came. Then a childish laugh, but with a broken tone, distorted, as if someone was playing it backwards. The echo spread through the maze of mirrors. "We have to get out of here," Mike murmured. We turned around. But the corridor we had entered was no longer there. The mirrors had changed position. It was as if the place was being reconfigured. The air became cold and the echo from laughter, it turned into a whisper. We didn't understand what he was saying, but it felt old, sick. We ran, twisted and turned through the maze, bumping into the mirrors with our own images, mocking us. At one point I saw my own reflection, but it blinked. After I did, the fear turned to pure panic. We finally found a way out. We rushed for the door, feeling the fresh air against our faces. But the nightmare was not over. The park was no longer the same. The attractions that were once silent and abandoned had been turned on. The neon lights were flickering, tinkling erratically. The carousel was spinning with its horses frozen in an eternal race. The Ferris wheel moved by itself, its empty cabins creaking in the wind, and the worst thing was there were sounds, voices, laughter, as if the park were full of invisible people. "Run," whispered Sarah. We ran. But no matter which way we went, the road took us back to the center of the park. It was as if the place was holding us back. Finally we arrived at the old puppet theater. Its stage was empty, but in the stands there were shadows, dozens of figures sitting watching us in silence. And then one of them stood up, its head turned too slowly. The laughter came back louder. It wasn't an echo. It was something real, and he was coming for us. The next hour was a nightmare of endless corridors, doors that led nowhere, and shadows that moved. When we weren't looking, we lost Mike in the haunted house. The last we heard was his muffled scream, followed by absolute silence. Jess disappeared into the old train car. He walked away from us for a second, and he was no longer at the end. We were just Sarah and I ran from hand to the entrance. The gates of the park were shining in the light of dawn. We almost made it, but then Sarah stumbled. I stopped to help her. That second of indecision doomed us. Something grabbed her. Her eyes met mine, ran, and pushed me away. I reached the exit when the sun knocked on the doors. The gates slammed shut. I turned looking for Sarah, but she was gone. The park had her taken. Now every night I see new people come in, explorers like us. I know what will happen to them. I want to warn them, but I can't, because now I'm part of Paradise Park. My smile painted is permanent. My eyes don't belong to me anymore. Laughter never stops. So if you ever see an abandoned amusement park and you feel the need to explore it, don't do it. Because here at Paradise Park the fun never ends, and neither does the moment I opened that package. I knew I had fallen into something much bigger and more dangerous than I could have imagined. What I didn't know was that it would turn my quiet stay in a hotel into a deadly game of cat and mouse. Had arrived at the Pinewood Hotel late at night, exhausted after a whole day of business meetings. It was a standard chain hotel, nothing exceptional, but immaculate. Comfortable enough for a night or two. The lobby was almost empty. Only the receptionist with a bored expression, who barely looked up from her computer when handing me the card for my room, room 317, said in a monotone voice, "The elevators are on the left, exit at 11. I nodded and took the elevator. The hallway on the 3rd floor was deserted. The only sound was the distant hum of the ice machine at the end of the hallway. I found my room, and upon entering something caught my attention. There was a small package right in front of my door. At first I thought maybe I had dropped something from my suitcase, but when I bent down I saw that it had a shipping label. It was not addressed to me. The recipient was someone named Yada Marston. I should have ignored it. I must have called the reception and told them that it was not mine, but the curiosity beat me. I picked it up. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. I took it inside the room and left it on the desk, looking at it cautiously. The return address had been crossed out with black marker. It also had no postage stamps. This had not arrived by mail. Someone had left it here at hand. Something inside me told me that I should not open it, that whatever was inside was none of my business. But the temptation was too strong. I unwrapped the brown paper carefully and discovered a simple cardboard box with no labels. Inside was a stack of documents. file folders, and what appeared to be photographs. The first thing I saw was a handwritten note on top. J. This is all, be careful. They're watching you. My stomach churned. I took the first sheet of the package. It was a memo printed on what appeared to be official paper of a corporation. When I read it, my blood froze. It was about a massive cover-up. A major company had been illegally dumping toxic waste and falsifying environmental reports. Worst of all is that several deaths seemed to have been covered up. The names mentioned were great CEOs, politicians, public figures. I took a deep breath and dropped the document. This was not just sensitive information, it was dangerous, and now somehow I had it in. My fear got the better of me. If someone had left this on my bedroom door, then they believed I was Cha Marston, which meant that if the wrong person came to retrieve it, I would be the wrong target. I jumped to my feet and checked the lock on the door. It was secured. Then I went to the window and lifted the curtain a bit. A black sedan was parked across the street from the parking lot, with the engine running and a silhouette of someone sitting behind the wheel watching. I let go of the curtain and backed away, my heart thumping in my chest. This was bad, really bad. I had to leave. But if I was already being watched, I couldn't just walk down the front door with a suspicious package under my arm. I needed a plan, so I quickly emptied my suitcase and put my clothes in the hotel's drawers. Then, with extreme caution, I transferred all the contents of the box to my suitcase, covering it with papers and empty bottles. Then, there was a sharp knock on the door, and my blood froze. "Mr. Marston," a male voice called from the other side, and my breathing became shallow, so I didn't answer another knock. "Strong this time, Mr. Marston. Housekeeping. We needed to change the sheets. We're almost midnight." "What kind of hotel changes the sheets at midnight?" My mind worked fast. I couldn't stay here. I took the suitcase and prepared myself. If they tried to enter, I would have to run another blow, this time with more force. "Open the door, Mr. Marston. We know it's there." Panic consumed me. I didn't think about it anymore. I ran to the door. I slammed it open and pushed with all my strength. The man at the entrance, I don't know. I was waiting for him. He was big, dressed in a hotel uniform that fit him a little tight. He was definitely not housekeeping staff. I pushed him out of the way and shot down the hallway. Heard his growl of surprise before he started chasing me. Ran up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. The sound of his chase was loud. Behind me, I jumped the steps 2 at a time, going down to the lobby. The receptionist looked at me with wide open ears. I called the police. I screamed as I ran by. But she didn't do anything outside out of fear or because I was in complicity. She stood motionless. I went out to the street. Just as the black sedan roared when it turned on, I ran to my car. My hands were shaking as I took out the keys and opened the door. The black sedan started. I threw myself into the driver's seat and started the engine. In the rearview mirror, I saw how the man from the hotel ran away just as the sedan was accelerating behind me. Stepping on the accelerator, I skidded out of the parking lot. The sedan followed me. I drove like crazy, my heart beating hard, fast down the highway, zigzagging through the scarce traffic. They chased me for almost an hour. Finally, when I reached the outskirts of the next city, I managed to mislead the people in a dark side street. I waited in the darkness. 10 minutes passed. Nothing had escaped. But the problem was not over. Now I had explosive evidence and dangerous people in my possession. Behind me, I made a decision. Drove to the nearest police station, left the suitcase with the documents in front of the door, called the station, and gave an anonymous tip, then left. Days later, the story was in the news. Scandal shook the business and political elite. Arrests, resignations, everything fell apart, but I had to disappear. I moved. I changed my name. I never stopped looking over my shoulder because I know that there are people who still remember the man who checked into the wrong room and ruined their plans. The moment when the excited voice of the phone said my name, I knew that was not a wrong call. For the 10th call, I understood that my life would never be the same again. It all started on a Tuesday night. I had come home after a long day at work, kicked my shoes, and collapsed. That's when my phone rang. Unknown number. I usually don't answer calls from numbers I don't recognize, but something inside me told me to do it this time. "Hello," I said, waiting for a telemarketer or, in the worst case, a wrong number. Silence. Then just when I was about to hang up, a voice spoke. It was strange, like someone was using a voice modulator. "Hi Sarah." My blood froze. It wasn't a mistake. They knew my name. "Red fits you today." The air left my lungs. "How did they know who you are?" I asked, feeling My heart raced, the line cut off. I stared at the phone, hoping it was a joke stupid of someone at work, but I knew it wasn't. I got up and ran to the window, pushing Latina aside. Just a little nothing. I gave birth out of the norm. The cars parked in the UNAE, walking her dog, the same neighborhood I always worked, but everything I gave birth sinister. I closed the doors and I secured the door. Then I called Lisa, my best friend. You or someone at work are playing a joke on me. What not? What are you talking about? I told her what had happened. Lisa was silent for a few seconds before saying, "That's creepy, Sarah. You should call the police." I thought about it, but what would I tell them? I got a strange call. They would probably just tell me to block the number. I decided to let it go. I ordered my dinner, I put on my series and tried to forget the call. But an hour later the phone rang again. Same unknown number this time. I didn't answer. It rang 4 times and then stopped. A second later a text message came in. "Why don't you answer, Sarah? You don't want to talk to me." I dropped the phone. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. I blocked the number and turned off the lights in my apartment. I stayed in the dark, watching the street through a crack in the Cora. Nothing, no one, but I felt watched that night. I didn't sleep. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. When dawn broke, I felt like a mess. I called work and said I was sick. I couldn't go out. I couldn't face the thought of being outside vulnerable. At noon the phone rang again. Different unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later another text message. "Good choice. Stay home, Sarah. You can't hide forever." The phone fell out of my. How did they know I was home? There were cameras in my apartment. Someone was watching me from outside. I spent the next hour looking for hidden cameras in every corner. I found nothing. But that didn't reassure me. The calls and messages went on all day, more and more personal, more threatening. "The pizza you ordered last night looked delicious. Maybe we should share one sometime. Your mother would be disappointed. If I knew what you did last summer. Your boss knows about the files you accessed after hours." This wasn't just a stalker anymore. He knew things he couldn't know. By the night I was devastated. I hadn't eaten, I hadn't bathed, I had just walked back and forth, paranoid. And then the last call came. This time there was no distortion in the voice. "Hi, Sarah." The voice was soft, polite, but icy. "I think it's time we meet in person. Don't you think?" My throat went dry. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" Laughed a sound that chilled my bones. "Oh, Sarah, it's not about what I want from you." "Then what is it?" She paused and then said, "It's about what you're going to do for me." My stomach sank. "I'm going to call the police." "No, you won't." Her voice was still soft, calm. "Because if you do, I'll have to share some information with certain people." "Information about what?" "About what really happened to your father's company." My blood froze. How could I know that? I had covered my tracks perfectly. "See you on the corner of 5th and Main in an hour. Come alone." The call ended. I stood there with the phone still stuck to my ear. I could run. I could call the police. But what if I made good on her threat? I knew I had no choice. I wrote everything in a letter to Lisa. I left her on the kitchen table, grabbed my keys and left. The world went on as usual. But for me everything had changed. I parked a block away and I walked to the corner. There, under the light of a lantern, a man was waiting for me. It wasn't what I expected. He was wearing a suit. He had his hair salt and pepper and a well-groomed beard. He looked like a successful businessman. Not a monster, but he was. He smiled, but his eyes were empty. Sarah extended her hand. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." I didn't shake her hand. "What do you want from me?" She smiled. "But just a small favor." She took out a USB stick and showed it to me. "Here are names and accounts. I want you to do what you do best." I understood. I wanted her to launder money for him using the same skills. That had gotten me in trouble before. I took a breath. "And if I refuse?" His smile twisted. "You have no choice." And so began my worst nightmare, because from that moment on I was his and there was no way to escape.